Yes!
To the common everyday person, mental health isn't always highest on the priority list, and it's definitely not outside of the norm for mental health to take a backseat to physical health. Humankind heavily relies on perception in order to properly piece things together. So, say for example, we place two people side by side, and you were told that one of them was in physical discomfort and the other was in mental discomfort. The telltale signs of the person in physical pain is pretty obvious because in this instance, he's hunched over and holding his stomach. It wouldn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that this person is dealing with a pretty volatile stomachache. But what about the other person? He seems pretty normal, right? Well, he's the farthest thing from it. In fact, he's going through a full-on mental warfare right now, but it's harder to tell because your eyes can't see the pain that this person is dealing with. Granted, bad mental health or mental illness does give off physical cues, but it's always handled so differently that it isn't possible to tell if somebody is in good mental shape all the time. Now, there are people who were taught to smile through the pain, even during the lowest points of time in their lives, and in instances like these, there are almost zero physical cues to go by. However, in a simplistically denoted sense, mental scars are not less significant because they can't be seen by the naked eye. For instance, if we were to compare mental and physical abuse, it could be argued that mental abuse is worse because it can take longer to heal from. If someone were to slap you, for example, the pain from that slap will eventually go away, but if somebody were to refer you as something along the lines of useless or good for nothing or any disrespectful term, that's a stigma that could stick with you for the rest of your life. Now, some people really struggle with their self-image and self-esteem, and slandering a person with poor self-image could cause some long-lasting, serious psychological damage. Now, I'm pretty sure that this isn't common knowledge, but mental health awareness is completely unbeknownst to Black American communities. Mental health awareness is such a foreign concept to Black Americans. When it's brought up in conversation, it's either marginalized or completely dismissed. It's to the point where most Black people are currently undergoing a mental health battle and have zero awareness of it. What qualifies as abuse in this day and age was deemed acceptable and or the norm decades ago. For example, if you're at least 30 years old or older, it's highly unlikely that your parents or grandparents haven't shared stories with you about the use of physical discipline in public schools whenever growing up. This is a practice known as corporal punishment. In 1977, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in its Ingram versus Wright decision that school corporal punishment from that point on would be constitutional. This meant that it was up to the states on an individual level to decide to continue the practice. However, in 2023, corporal punishment is still legal in private schools in every U.S. state, for the exception of New Jersey and Iowa, and it's legal in public schools in 19 states. To be honest, this was news to me because I thought that corporal punishment was banned nationwide in the United States, probably because I myself and everybody else I know never attended a school where corporal punishment was allowed. But even though corporal punishment hasn't been completely abolished, it's definitely not as commonplace in the present day as it was 50 plus years ago due to the perception of what was deemed plausible back then. Now, I'm pretty sure there are multiple examples of teachers taking things way too far and full-on abusing students as opposed to simply disciplining them physically, which is what led to the decision to crack down on corporal punishment in the American academic system in the first place, because there's only so many times where you could turn a blind eye to something before it's forced to be addressed. But there has to come a point in time for us to realize that normality and commonplace are not the same. These were all common practices back then, but it doesn't take a genius to figure out why they were outlawed. But anyways, while we're on the subject of physical abuse, how often have you heard the phrase, "My parents beat me and I turned out fine," or something along those lines? Now, if you ask me, I would tell you that I would probably be a millionaire if I was paid $1 for every time I heard that comment. This is a very, very common statement used mostly by Black people, and I can't count how many times my Black friends and I would discuss the items we were beaten with and how many marks and bruises were left behind. And these were regular conversations we would have as if we were talking about how nice the weather was outside today. Does this make any sense to you? Because to me, it sounds like a bunch of abuse victims talking about who had the worst upbringing. Yeah, my mom beat me with belts, extension cords, and whatever else she could pick up. I'm not even playing around. These were real conversations me and my friends would have all the time, and the marginalization of physical abuse as a child leads to lack of awareness of mental health as an adult. I can speak on this personally because I thought that I was a perfectly normal human being who lived a happy, healthy life until I realized that I was dealing with several undiagnosed psychological ailments that I had zero awareness of. But unfortunately, I wasn't brought up in an environment where people with a heightened knowledge of human psychology were abundant. During my younger years, I was quick to anger, I had zero patience, and I was always told that I had, air quotes, anger issues, and Even though I didn't have the life experience and mental capacity to diagnose myself, I knew full well that I had bigger problems than just anger issues. Now, when I was in my 20s, it became an urgent priority for me to discover the origin of said anger issues, and I eventually stumbled upon a realization that I was suffering from childhood psychological trauma. And I came to the realization that there was never a such thing as simply having anger issues. I sought therapy for the sole purpose of finding somebody to help me connect some of the dots and bridge a few gaps, because without professional insight, I would eventually hit a roadblock and find myself unable to figure certain things out. Over time, I learned how to control my anger, and I figured out ways to heal from my past. And over the course of this journey, I discovered the origin of all of my problems, not just why I was angry all the time. And it felt liberating to know that I didn't just have anger issues and that was just the end of it. Now, I want y'all to listen up. If you're dealing with something similar, I suggest you seek professional help and don't allow anybody to minimize the severity of your problems. There's no such thing as anger issues, but there is a such thing as psychological trauma. Always remember that. And I can't express how lucky I am, because it's rare for people to possess the gift of augmented psychological insight, especially a Black person, because once again, mental health awareness is a complete mystery in Black communities. This is why millions of Black children grow up with problems and probably go their entire lives without ever receiving a diagnosis and end up traveling the most destructive paths. Always angry, rude, insensitive is society's overall perception of Black people. People from other race groups penalize us for being quick to anger, and this is the same exact reason why Black people are the most commonly targeted race group for prank videos. If you pay close attention, the environment of most prank videos is the air quotes hood, and it's usually Black people on the receiving end of these pranks. And this is done deliberately, and those who are in charge of these pranks are fully aware that Black people will always give the best reactions. Because if the prank victims aren't reacting, the video loses its purpose. Now, if you ever watch any of these prank videos, you'll notice the difference between the reactions of white and Black people are a day and night difference. White people usually act nonchalantly and won't take the prank seriously most of the time, but usually things escalate to violence when it comes to Black people. The pranksters are usually threatened, chased, or receive some form of physical harm if a Black person is on the receiving end of one of their pranks. And I never feel sorry for any of these people conducting the pranks, because they know exactly what they're doing, because the best reactions make the best content, simply put. But has anybody ever figured out how the Black race got to a point where most of us are perpetually angry and ignorant of mental health awareness? Well, there's a certain concept known as generational trauma. The excerpt I'm about to read is quoted from an article I found online known as "What is Generational Trauma" at health.com. Now, it states that many things get passed down through families, like heirlooms, genetic conditions, and physical characteristics. In some cases, trauma can be inherited too. Generational trauma, also known as intergenerational trauma or transgenerational trauma, is a field of study that researchers have a lot to discover regarding its impact in people who experience it. Here's what we know. According to experts, generational trauma is trauma that just isn't experienced by one person. It extends from one generation to the next. It can be silent, covert, and undefined, surfacing through nuances and inadvertently taught or implied throughout someone's life from an early age onward. If this is your first time hearing about this, I'm pretty sure you realize how much sense it actually makes. Several hundred years ago, when Blacks were enslaved, they all lived lives of abuse, neglect, and were perceived as subhuman. The trauma they endured was passed down to their offspring, then their offspring's offspring, and things continued this way for generations. Why is that? Because abuse is an emulative, parasitic cycle, and it'll continue to wreak its havoc until somebody in the abuse chain breaks it. When I was growing up in the 90s, it was common for Black kids to be beaten with belts and other household items, as I mentioned before, and those of us that grew up and became parents thought that we were perfectly normal. Well, newsflash, you aren't normal. In fact, we're the farthest thing from normal. And to respond to the statement, "My parents beat me and I turned out fine," I mentioned earlier, that's quite the opposite, because you're probably inflicting the same trauma on your kids that you dealt with in the past. So no, you didn't turn out fine. And if you continue to avoid responsibility of fixing yourself, you'll only perpetuate the cycle of abuse. So remember, any and every abuser was an abuse victim themselves. However, in Black culture, there's little to no distinction between physical discipline and physical abuse. Well, the line between physical abuse and physical punishment can be thin at times, but there are some very stark differences. But Black people as a whole have become so desensitized to neglect that distinction is hardly ever made. Why is that? Well, in Black culture, we're taught to always respect as sometimes fear our parents no matter what. But when our parents, the people expected to be our main providers, are the source of the abuse, it's rare for this to ever be realized. And usually your fight or flight response will take control in the midst of an abuse episode. But when the person abusing you is the same person you were taught to blindly respect and not second guess and question the decisions of, the severity of the matter is usually swept under the rug. Black children usually have high opinions of their mothers because it's very common for black fathers to be absent from the household. Life becomes very detrimental for the run-of-the-mill single black mom because not only is she forced to raise her children alone, she's also dealing with mental health problems herself. This is even worse for young single black mothers because teen pregnancy is another common occurrence in black communities. So imagine how difficult things would be for a teenage single black mother who lacks mental and emotional maturity to properly make decisions and take care of herself, let alone another child when she's pretty much a child herself. Growing up, I vividly recall my parents quoting a Bible verse, "Honor thy mother and father," which translate to respect your parents, and if you're black, it's likely that you've dealt with the same exact thing. Now factor this in. We've been so aggressively indoctrinated to blindly respect our parents, we never stop to think that we're just as deserving of respect as well, and we were always told that our parents spank us out of love. This mind state derives from another Bible verse regarding to Proverbs 13:24, which states, "Spare the rod, spoil the child." And it's a very popular saying. It comes from the Bible where the verse reads, "He who spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is diligent to discipline him." I agree with this verse because not only does it make sense, it has logical backing. If you don't discipline your children, you're disservicing them because they'll never truly learn right from wrong. Sure, they'll easily be able to differentiate between the simplicity of what's good and what's bad, but they'll never be able to fully grasp the concept of consequential thinking. You ever hear the stories of kids doing unthinkably disrespectful things such as stealing from their parents or even physically abusing them? Well, when the latter comes to mind, I always think of an old episode of Dr. Phil where this one kid slapped his mom in the face, pointed at her and told her it was his turn to talk. And if you're a black person who saw this episode, the first thing that popped into your mind might have been something along the lines of, "I would have beaten the daylights out of that boy," or "My mama would have killed me if I did this to her." And that makes perfect sense because black people usually have no tolerance for disrespect. And that usually applies double when it comes to their children. Hence the phrase, "I brought you into this world, I can take you out." That's one of the most famous black mom catchphrases. So if you know, you know. But anyways, if you're guilty of giving your kids whatever they want, not holding them accountable for their bad decisions and not disciplining them, you'll end up with a spoiled, rotten hellspawn like that kid from that Dr. Phil episode that I discussed a bit earlier. Now, that's pretty much what the Bible verse is saying, but back to it. This Bible verse states that you should discipline your offspring, not abuse them. And again, it always seemed that black parents aren't always able to make that distinction. So it's common for black children to have battle scars to prove it. And any and every time you utilize this form of quote unquote discipline, it's abuse, point blank, period. Oh, and familial abuse doesn't exclusively occur at home either. Myself and almost every other black person I know has dealt with abuse from a relative that wasn't our parents. I'm fully aware that there's at least one toxic relative in every family, but in black families, the toxic relatives are hardly held accountable, and again, it all just gets swept under the rug. Growing up, I've never once seen or heard of an instance where my relatives argued, fought, or had any type of disagreement and were able to talk things out and place their differences aside. Actually, it's quite the opposite that occurs. They usually just stop talking for weeks, months, and sometimes years on end and eventually return to each other's lives later. No beforehand apologies, no talking, no hugs, none of that. They just fall out and become cool again later on down the line. This is what I was accustomed to seeing growing up, but when I entered adulthood, I distanced myself from my toxic relatives and my life became leaps and bounds better afterwards. And if you're in a similar predicament, I can only suggest that you do the same thing. Don't ever let anybody gaslight you into rethinking the reasoning of your decisions, because anybody who disagrees with a decision that you made to help yourself is just as bad as the people you cut out of your life. And if that's ever the case, you need to add them to that list too. Your relatives are not more deserving of forgiveness simply because of the blood ties. It doesn't matter if it's one of your parents, siblings, cousins, or whatever. Your relatives should be held accountable for whatever they did, just like everybody else. All right, classmates, that does it for this one. It might be a long time before the black race as a whole develops a better sense of mental health awareness, but it'll only happen if we continue to talk about it. Continuing to sweep things under the rug will only perpetuate the problem, but giving attention to it might encourage more black people to seek the assistance they need to become healthier mentally. If you made it to the end of today's lesson and enjoyed what you learned, do me a favor and thumb rest to that like button till it turns blue. And if you're new on campus, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and click that bell icon, and you will never miss another lesson at the Elite Nation University again. But with that being stated, this concludes another lesson at the Elite Nation University. Class is dismissed. Y'all take it easy.
Yes!